It's my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of this morning's session, Marlene Behrmann from Carnegie Mellon. Marlene.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'll start that again. It's still a really great pleasure to be here. And I'm very grateful to Marius for sending me such excellent details on the logistics, and many thanks to the organizers for persisting to invite me year after year.
It's not the right size.
Okay, all right, don't worry, thanks. Okay, my talk today examines whether the neural mechanisms that subserve the recognition of faces and words are entirely independent or are flip sides of the same coin, tethered in some meaningful way, bound together inextricably. One of the long-standing debates in cognitive neuroscience is whether particular brain regions subserve particular cognitive functions. This one-to-one brain behavior relationship is well exemplified in many studies of ventral visual cortex, in which discrete regions appear to be associated with specific classes of visual objects. So the fusiform face area for faces, occipital face area, body areas, place areas, visual word form areas, and this is just in ventral cortex. Of course, the list goes on. In today's talk, I want to examine this assertion of segregation of function in the context of the FFA and the VWFA, often thought of as paradigmatic domain-specific regions of cortex. In fact, there are good theoretical reasons for there to be segregation of representation for faces and words. The first is that the image statistics of these two visual classes are essentially non-overlapping. There is really nothing in common here. It's also the case that these two classes have got a very different evolutionary trajectory, with faces obviously having a much longer time course of representation than more recently acquired visual skills, such as words. And lastly, the acquisition over the course of development is entirely different for these two classes of stimuli, with face recognition acquired roughly incidentally in the majority of individuals, and word recognition acquired through directed instruction in the majority of individuals. Of course, the assertion of independence is strongly played out in a host of empirical domains, including in the neuropsychological domain, in which a lesion to the right occipitotemporal cortex gives rise to disproportionately poorer face recognition than recognition of other classes, and in complementary fashion, a lesion to the left occipitotemporal cortex gives rise to an impairment in word recognition in the absence of a general language impairment, suggesting that there are separate regions in the different hemispheres with specialized, possibly even exclusive responsibility for a particular stimulus class. And just to continue a little further, support for the segregation, of course, comes from a host of other methodological studies as well. Here is electrophysiological data showing the N170 waveform that is disproportionately greater for faces than any other of the stimulus classes, cars, birds, or furniture, especially over the right compared to the left hemisphere. And in complementary fashion, a greater N170 for orthographic over non-orthographic stimuli, in fact, in this case, only in the left hemisphere. And lastly, there's considerable evidence, as you all know, from fMRI studies, here one of the classic studies, showing face selective activation in the right hemisphere in the fusiform gyrus, and from a PET and fMRI study showing selective activation for words over the left occipitotemporal cortex. Okay, this certainly suggests that there are separate regions with separate domain specificities. But if one steps back from the data, there appear to be many similarities, in fact, in the computations and neural mechanisms that give rise to face and word recognition. In fact, in most, if not all studies, there is invariably bilateral activation for faces and for words. And let me show you. Here are data from a somewhat older study done with Uri Hasson, in which we showed here on inflated cortex, here on flat maps, that individuals show letter selective activation in purple or face selective activation in orange in both hemispheres. However, there is differential weighting, so you can probably see more orange in the right hemisphere, i.e. more face selectivity, and more purple in the left hemisphere, i.e. more word selectivity. So I think we might want to consider this as bilateral activation with differential weighting or optimization in the two hemispheres. It's also the case that if one derives the peak of the coordinates in Taylor-Rack space for faces and for words, they actually appear to be extremely similar to each other. And in the few ERP studies that examine responses for faces and words in the same individuals, you also see bilateral activation for faces, albeit greater in the right hemisphere, and bilateral activation for words, albeit greater in the left hemisphere. It seems then that there is surprising parallelism when one begins to step back and look at the entire picture rather than putting a spotlight over some particular region of cortex. There are other similarities as well. If one maps out the developmental trajectory of the emergence of these regions, one sees the following. So if you look at the maturation of the FFA, here are data from adults on the inferior or the lateral surface, and you can see the very well-established topography of these category selective regions. Young children, age 5 to 8, don't seem to show any of the specificity, and whereas adolescents begin to show the more mature adult-like pattern, showing this prolonged developmental acquisition. Similar findings have been shown by the Gollerine-Grill-Spector study. And we see a similar maturation of the visual word form area, where compared to adults, children here aged 6.5 to 11, they're already at school learning to read, don't yet show the adult-like pattern, showing just a sort of smidgen of visual word selective activation. And so the developmental trajectory really seems to be shared. It's also the case that both of these regions, VWFA and FFA, can be tuned by experience. This is Chris Baker's study, in which we see plotted here percent signal change in the visual word form area in English readers strongly for English orthography, and in Hebrew readers most strongly for Hebrew orthography, although note, of course, that there is responses across a whole range of stimulus types. But this suggests that these regions are tuned by one's own reading history. And the correlate of that is the experience-dependent tuning of the fusiform face area, say, over the course of Greeble training. That's the sessions of training. Greebles are in these shaded bars. Oops. Yeah, and you can see the increase in the selectivity for Greebles in the so-called FFA. So again, very similar patterns. Lastly, there are a couple of behavioral signatures that are shared in the processing of faces and words. So this is, these are for faces, these are for words. This is the angle of rotation in which the stimulus is presented from upright to inverted in both of these cases. This is reaction time on the y-axis, and you can see that over the course of orientation shift, there is a significant increase in reaction time in both of these stimuli. I included Obama here because that's the kind of thing that Americans do, and now I'm partly American. What I should have done is I should have included Hillary Clinton's face. So next time, that's what I'll do. Okay. It's also the case that the nature of the deficits are very similar. So, for example, in individuals following a left visual word form lesion, you see this classic word length effect, increase in reaction time with an increase in the number of features in the stimuli, reflecting this laborious sequential processing of elements. And you see in prosopagnosic individuals this very laborious featural encoding reflected here in the eye movement pattern where they're seeking out the individual features. Okay, so at this point, you should be saying, enough, I get it, there are similarities. In fact, you should be struck by the surprising parallelism here. And what you should be thinking is, wow, this really suggests homology rather than independence. And it suggests that there is graded rather than binary representation or binary distinction between faces and words in the two hemispheres. In the rest of the talk, I'm going to argue then that it behooves us to think about face and word recognition as the emergent property of common principles that play out over different image statistics. And I'm going to lay out these common principles. The first one is that both faces and words, by virtue of the homogeneity of the exemplars, require fine-grained visual discrimination. And by virtue of this, both of these stimuli, or the activation of both of these stimuli, come to occupy the anterior extrapolation of the foveal region. Let me tell you what I mean. So if we go back to this study that I showed you earlier, I'm specifically interested here in why it is that the VWFA and the FFA are cited in this particular location in cortex. In the same experiment, we collected eccentricity maps from the individuals. So the purple and the orange here are really just the outlines of the localizer data that I showed you earlier, superimposed on the eccentricity, with blue showing central and green showing more peripheral. And as you can see, these regions are exactly cited over the activation associated with central vision for high detailed visual discrimination. This is also consistent with the argument that's been made by Yifat Levy and Rafi Malach and colleagues, and that is that in their study, relative to retinotopic boundaries, which they mapped out, the fusiform area in this particular slide occupies what would be the extrapolation of retinotopic areas had it continued into extrastriate cortex. Okay, so the first principle is that the site of activation, or the candidate region, is one which would facilitate fine-grained stimulus discrimination. The second principle is that information that is required to be co-activated should come to be represented in proximal regions. So for word activation, the visual stimuli together with the semantics and the phonology should all come to be in close proximity with each other, whereas information that's not required, for example, having to do with, say, facial expression, should be maximally segregated. So things that should go together do go together, things that are orthogonal should be pushed apart. And this would result from a series of kind of cooperative, in the first case, and competitive interactions. And lastly, the pressure for local connectivity to keep these regions together is what drives the optimization of word recognition to the left hemisphere. So because language in the majority of individuals is left hemisphere dominant, the pressure for local connectivity between visual regions and language regions should come to drive word recognition predominantly into the left hemisphere, and by virtue of the segregation of incompatible information, face representations will be shunted out primarily, although no, not entirely, to the right hemisphere. So we've instantiated these principles in a set of computational models. I'm just going to show you, just for illustration purposes, a kind of toy example to give you a sense of the implementation. So this is a hemispheric model. Stimuli are presented more centrally, the faces and the words. I'm going to show you houses that also have some peripheral representation. These are various parts of the visual system with bidirectional feedback. And then the two hemispheres with this language pressure that arises in the left hemisphere. The stimuli are 32 by 32 bit schematic line drawings of faces and houses, and essentially they embody the critical differences in the demand of recognition for the different classes of stimuli. So for faces, the eyes can be closer together, and the interocular distance, difference between the nose and the mouth, etc., sort of the standard separation of height of eyes, length of nose, and height and width of mouth. We also have a series of words, and we have a series of houses which differ in terms of a broader range of properties. So as you can see, it extends somewhat a lot more broadly over the input, and the differences here are in the windows and the roof and all kinds of things. So each face, word, and house is presented at 9 different scales for a total of 387 input patterns. And we generate retinotopic input by deriving polar coordinates for the stimuli through smoothing and transforming the original bit patterns, and we do this at the different spatial scales, so that at least we can have something that looks like a more veridical input to the visual system. Actually, our more recent work takes much more realistic stimuli and uses those in these simulations. For illustration purposes, this will suffice to show you that these are the inputs. I think this is the word dig, with greater activation in more central parts than more peripheral parts of the input. Here is the rest of the system. Notice that you've got this language region, and the output is simply for the model to settle on a representation for one of the words, and in this case it's the word dig, or one of the faces, or one of the houses. And that's the language area. Okay, over the course of acquisition, the model, of course, has no problem gaining asymptote on any of the stimulus classes. And now we're going to lesion this model, and this is a representation of the right hemisphere. And the way in which we lesion it is systematically pull out 3 adjacent columns of these intermediate fusiform units, and then we measure recognition across all of the stimuli across all scales. So there's a little example. Okay, so this is what happens with lesion location, and this shows correct performance of the model after left fusiform lesion. Unsurprisingly, words are really, really poorly recognized when the lesion is to the more central parts of the representation. Faces are only a little bit affected and houses are unaffected. And when the right hemisphere is lesioned, of course, faces are most affected after the central lesions, words to some extent, and then houses are affected as the lesion is to the more peripheral parts of the input. So this simulation essentially instantiates the assumption of the shared central representation for faces and words, somewhat weighted in the 2 hemispheres by virtue of the additional information for language in the left hemisphere, say, versus houses. Okay. These are the assumptions of the common principles, and mostly I've focused on this one up to this point in time. The remaining part of the talk is going to examine a number of predictions that emerge from these principles. So I've already told you about the activation of the anterior extrapolation of the fovea. If it is indeed the case that both hemispheres are functionally involved in the representation of faces and words, then you might expect to see activation for faces and words in both hemispheres within a single individual. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of data from a single experiment in which we will conduct multivariate analyses for both face and word stimuli. Participants come into the lab, they see these 4 faces, 4 identities invariant over expression. They have to learn a 4-way discrimination. This is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they do the same thing for pseudo words. These don't have any semantics, so these don't have any semantics. And again, 4-way discrimination invariant over font. They then come to the scanner for, 8 hours or some amount of time like that. I think, some long experiment. It's a slow event related. They're doing an explicit individuation task on first a face stimulus and then a non-word stimulus, and then we analyze the data using a spatiotemporal searchlight in which we examine which regions of cortex support above chance discrimination for facial identity. And you can see there is a whole host of regions that are able to show above chance discrimination. Note here that each of these voxels is the centroid of the searchlight. It's not that there is a single voxel. There's a host of voxels. That's just the centroid of it. Turns out that some of the same regions support letter string individuation, and I'm going to show you data from this particular region in a single individual using multivariate classifier that shows that in this very region, within an individual, you can see voxels that show above chance discrimination for visual word forms in green, for faces in yellow, and even some voxels that appear to multitask or multiplex. Suggesting that the very same region appears to be activated in this interdigitated fashion for faces and words. So if this is really true, that there is activation in both cortices for both faces and words, then one might expect that a lesion to either hemisphere should result in a decrement for both stimulus classes. In fact, one might make this specific prediction, and that is that if you have a lesion that gives rise, a lesion to the left cortex that gives rise to alexia, you might expect to be really impaired at words and somewhat to faces. And the complement is if you have a right hemisphere FFA lesion, you would be really impaired at faces and only somewhat impaired at words relative to control individuals. And to show you data from 4 pure alexic individuals, 3 prosopagnosic individuals who are tested on a whole range of word experiments and a whole range of face experiments. I'm just going to give you a sort of smattering of each of those. I need to tell you that none of these patients has any low-level visual deficit to the extent that we see decrements for both face and word processing. It's not because they have a lower-level sensory deficit. They're normal on all these various things. Okay, here is an example of a word experiment. Subjects see letters words that are 3, 5, or 7 letters in the center of a computer screen. We measure the reaction time to their naming latency. This is the standard monotonic increase in reaction time as a function of word length in pure alexic individuals. What I really want to draw your attention to is this green bar here, which shows a word length effect in the prosopagnosic individuals that falls intermediate between the alexics and the controls. And so we see one part of this prediction being upheld. Here is an example experiment from face discrimination. 2 stimuli appear on the screen for same different judgment. The 2 faces could be exactly the same. Or we manipulate the level of difficulty through a morphing paradigm in which the 2 faces are entirely different, face A paired with face B. This is an easy discrimination. Or we morph the choice to be 33% face A and 66% face B, or in the most difficult case, you have face A paired with another stimulus that's 66% face A, 33% face B. Think about this as kind of challenge to the perceptual system. And what we see here is that the alexics and the these are the control data. Of course, as the level of difficulty increases, this is the error rate. Performance is more errorful. And here are the data from the alexics and the prosopagnosics. These controls belong to these people. These controls belong to these people. Suffice it to say that performance on the difficult condition is terrible for everybody. But what's more relevant here is that performance in the easy and medium condition are much more, the error rate is much higher in the 2 patient populations relative to their controls. And so we see the complement. So leading us to conclude that bilateral activation is not simply epiphenomenal. That you see face and word activation in a single hemisphere of a single individual is not epiphenomenal. Rather, lesioning to one of these critical areas gives rise to decrement in both of the stimulus classes, so that there appears to be a functional contribution of the representations in a single hemisphere for both stimulus classes. Okay, so one question you might ask then is, how is it possible that we read in the literature about patients who have pure alexia with seeming no other impairments? Well, I will tell you firstly that most often the studies of pure alexic individuals never test them on faces, and the studies of prosopagnosics don't test them on words. It is the case, however, that if one looks on an individual by individual basis, it turns out that there is an interesting distribution of the complementarity of these 2 hemispheres. So I only have a little bit of data which maps out the individual variability in the dissociation or association between faces and words. So plotted here, this is a functional imaging study. You lie there, you see faces, you see words, we calculate the activation in each of the hemispheres, we subtract the activation from the right hemisphere away from the left hemisphere, and vice versa for faces, and you get this kind of distribution. So notice that people down here seem to have really pretty equal balance in the activation of both words in the 2 hemispheres and faces in the 2 hemispheres. Really pretty sort of equilibrium in the representation. We only have 17 subjects so far. But it is the case that we do see individuals up here who seem to show much greater lateralization of function. And here is a little illustration of this person who shows activation just in the right hemisphere for faces and just in the left hemisphere for words. And my prediction is that this person is a future pure lexic or prosopagnosic. If a lesion occurs to one of these hemispheres, this person is taken out of the functional loop. Sort of a dire prediction. You probably don't want to be in my experiment. Okay, so I've argued that a lesion to either hemisphere for the majority of individuals results in a decrement to both stimulus classes, although there is some variability in the population. And there are actually interesting questions about what might give rise to the dynamics of cooperation and competition over the course of development that drives the more extreme versions of lateralization. Okay, in the very last part of the talk, I'd like to spend some time talking about perhaps the key principle that gives rise to the emergence of the adult mature pattern. And the key principle here is that over the course of development, as the face and word recognition representations come online over this long developmental trajectory, if you examine the cooperation and competition, the claim is that initially, well, I can tell you, the claim is that initially in young children, there is no lateralization, as I showed you on the functional imaging. There is, in fact, no activation for either words or faces very early on. The claim here is that as word recognition is acquired, by virtue of the pressure to be proximal to language areas on the left-hand side, there is then consequent lateralization of faces to the right. So the important point here is that the acquisition of word recognition, the tuning and optimization of the left hemisphere to couple visual areas with language areas, then drives face lateralization to some extent as a function of different individuals to the right hemisphere. So I'm going to first show you some developmental data which shows that word recognition is the trigger, is the source for lateralization. And then I'm going to show you some data that tests this prediction. If word recognition, if the establishment of this left hemisphere system is abnormal, then we would also expect unusual lateralization of faces. And I'm going to show you data from left-handers, and I'm going to show you some data from developmental dyslexia. Okay, let's start off with this business about word recognition being the driving force. So I'm going to show you data from a group of adults, adolescents, and children. They're all right-handed. I'll show you the behavioral paradigm first. They sit in front of a computer screen with an eye tracker. They see a face or a word in the center of the screen for a fairly long duration, 750 milliseconds, and it's long because we want these kids to actually have seen something. And then very briefly, a stimulus is presented to either the right or the left visual field for a same different match. Okay? And we ensure that they're fixating. And we counterbalance the keys, and we do the same experiment for words, and we counterbalance the keys so that we have a 2 by 2 within subject, stimulus face word in the left-right visual field as a function of age. And we see the following. So this is accuracy here on the y-axis for faces and for words. These are the adult data, and you see in the adults exactly what you would expect, i.e. greater accuracy for faces presented to the left visual field and right visual field, greater accuracy for words in the right visual field over the left visual field. Okay. In the young adolescents, we begin to see some word hemispheric superiority, i.e. words presented to the right visual field are significantly more accurately reported than to the left visual field, but we don't see any lateralization of faces. And if we go to young children, who, of course, whose accuracy is much lower, we also see better detection of words in the right visual field than the left visual field, and no face lateralization. So we see an earlier emergence of word lateralization. And the claim here is that it's the pressure to read that drives the emergence of face lateralization. In particular, we can show that the degree of lateralization in recognizing faces presented to the right or the left visual field is well predicted by the reading comprehension scores of the young adolescents and the children, even after subtracting away their IQ, their performance scores, their, I don't know, the scores of their relatives, I don't know, whatever. This relationship still holds pretty robustly. We then went on to obtain neural support in an ERP study by examining the hemispheric profile of the N170 in children and in adults. There's actually a new group of individuals. We replicate the same behavioral data with better superiority in the adults than in the children. I'm going to show you the ERP results, particularly here on the N170, but I'm happy to show other results if people want to have me talk about it later. And we're just deriving the waveforms of particular posterior electrodes, and I can also tell you more about it later. So this is the group average waveform in the adults and in the children. For those of you who do ERP, you probably know that you get like whopping deflections, both positive and negative in kids. There sort of seems to be some hyper-reflexive ERP magnitudes. So this is the N170 amplitude, and you can see in adults, as one might expect, and this is over hemisphere rather than visual field, because that's where the electrodes are situated. There is greater negative deflection here. Negative means it's a good thing. Negative deflection for words over the left than the right hemisphere, and greater negative deflection for faces over the right than the left hemisphere. And in the kids, notwithstanding this great amplitude, we see the superiority for words over the left hemisphere in 170, and there is no difference in the faces. So the claim here is that it's the pressure for word reading and the early emergence of word recognition which subsequently drives the face lateralization. So if this is true, then you might expect that anything that messes up this optimization of the left hemisphere for word recognition would have adverse consequent effects on face recognition. And I'm going to show you data from two instances. And the one is going to be from individuals who are left-handed. So of course, language in left-handed individuals is much less obviously left hemisphere dominant. There are all kinds of different profiles associated with left-handedness. And the question is, in such individuals where the pressure for proximity might be less stable, what is the effect on the lateralization of faces? And the second data set that I'll show you is from individuals who have difficulty acquiring word recognition, i.e. developmental dyslexics, and what is the consequence on face recognition. So here are data from right versus left-handers. It's a whole new group of adults. It's basically the same experiment, the same result that you have now seen 3 times. This is the amplitude of the N170, and again, this is sort of exactly the pattern that you would expect. Greater negative deflection for words over the left and right hemisphere, greater negative deflection for faces over the right than, over the right than the left hemisphere. And the critical result here is what happens with the 24 left-handed college students. The first thing to note is that performance is, there is only a trend towards better word recognition over the left than the right hemisphere. No lateralization whatsoever. This is really pretty flat. This is true both in the behavior, and this is also true in the negative deflection of the N170. So the instability of language in the left hemisphere in left-handers has a knock-on effect on the lateralization of faces. The results are in fact, we did not assess, say, for example, in functional imaging or even through WADA or some other sort of fancy or dichotic listening or something, exactly which hemisphere language was dominant in these left-handed individuals. So they're a mixed bag. And even in this mixed bag, we're beginning to see some knock-on effects of the failure of lateralization of word recognition on the lateralization of face recognition. Okay, and it is the case that in these individuals, you can see on a case-by-case basis that the amplitude of the N170 for words in the left hemisphere drives the lateralization of the N170 to the right hemisphere for face recognition in these individuals. Again, reflecting some kind of interhemispheric cooperative and competitive dynamic, showing the tethering between the lateralization of words and the lateralization of faces. Okay, and again, this is even when one regresses out handedness, accuracy, blah, blah. Okay, in similar fashion, I'm going to show you that data from developmental dyslexics are very similar to this instability that one sees in the left-handers. So, as you all know, developmental dyslexia reflects the difficulty in the acquisition of word recognition, and it could be for a whole host of different reasons. I'm going to show you, firstly, that developmental dyslexics are not only impaired at word recognition, they're also impaired at face recognition, as one might have predicted. But moreover, I'm going to show you that the lateralization of face recognition in the developmental dyslexics is perturbed. Here are data from the controls. Actually, we are now, these days, we're plotting inverse efficiency rather than just accuracy, because in fact you can capture both the accuracy and the reaction time well in a single index. Here is the control data. You should already know it. You should already love this profile by now. Here are the data from the developmental dyslexics, obviously much slower and actually rather unstable performance over the left and the right hemisphere in their behavioral performance. I should say here that now we're also plotting hemisphere rather than visual field, just so that we can have more compatibility between the behavioral and the ERP results. Instead of showing you visual field in the one and hemisphere in the other, we just are using hemisphere consistently. And in particular, what I want to point out to you is if you look at the N170 amplitude, the controls replicate the standard result. We see no real hemispheric differences for either words or faces in the developmental dyslexics. And so the claim here is that when there is a failure for this driving force to be in place, either in left-handers or in the developmental dyslexics, it not only affects the acquisition of word recognition in the left hemisphere, but it also affects the lateralization of faces to the right hemisphere. Okay, so there are a number of other findings in the literature which support this idea of competition and cooperation between the two hemispheres, and the idea that it is really word recognition and literacy that lies at the very heart of this emergent process. And I'd like to draw your attention to the findings from Stan DeHaan study. This is from the Science paper. He's got a Nature Reviews Neuroscience paper in 2015 that if you haven't yet read, hasten to read it. Don't walk, run. Okay, the finding is summarized as follows. So there are individuals who are illiterate, that's purple. Then there are individuals who used to be illiterate, but they've learned to read to some extent in adulthood, and they sort of blue. And then you've got literate individuals who've learned to read in childhood. Here are the data from the left occipital temporal cortex, let's say the visual word form activation. You can see that illiterates and even the ex-illiterates really have rather little visual word form activation. This is their reading capabilities per minute. Obviously, these people can't read all that well, and they commensurately show rather little visual word form activation. These individuals in the left hemisphere are actually showing pretty high face activation in the left visual word form area. Okay, because nothing has competed with it to shunt out those face representations. As one learns to read, so here you begin to see a reduction in the face selectivity in the left visual word form area as literacy begins to come online. And in the right fusiform area, there is a little bit of letter string activation. Actually, I think the y-axis is incorrectly labeled. So this is my attempt to show you that this is actually the activation in the fusiform face area. They say VWFA, but I think they mean FFA in the right hemisphere. Notice that the illiterates have very little letter string activation. The literate individuals have some letter string activation on the right-hand side, and in all sets of individuals, there is some activation for faces on the right-hand side. The key finding that you want to understand is the relationship between these two purple dots, and then what happens as literacy begins, such that the tuning of the left visual word form area as one acquires word recognition gives rise to the reduction in face recognition from the left to the right-hand side. Okay, so the key claim here is that the representation of faces and words occur in both hemispheres. In fact, they are not segregated, and when you look closely using, say, MVPA searchlights, you can see interdigitated voxels in the same region of cortex that show above chance discrimination for either words or faces. There is, however, some weighting with greater representation of faces in the right than in the left hemisphere, and vice versa for words in the left versus right hemisphere. I've also suggested to you that this adult, mature mapping or category selective topography is an emergent function from experience and the interactive dynamics that play out over a series of common principles, including the competition for representation in the anterior part of the fovea in both hemispheres for words and faces that have homogeneous exemplars. That information that is needed for word recognition over the course of development comes to be highly coupled and connected, and by virtue of that coupling, there is competition and segregation of incompatible information, and that the topography of word recognition comes about because of the strong pressure for visual word areas to be coupled with language areas in the left hemisphere, and the segregation of incompatible information is essentially shunted out or defaulted to the right hemisphere. I've played out these common principles in terms of face and word recognition, but you may recognize them as playing out in hosts of other cognitive domains as well, and I'll draw your attention to two of them. So for those of you who are involved in studying the anterior temporal lobe, very similar arguments exist in the literature. So with some arguing that the left anterior temporal lobe is either verbal or and the right is non-verbal, or there's a social non-social distinction. It turns out there is actually a more graded bilateral representation both of verbal, non-verbal, and social non-social information. And you might want to look at the Rice paper for recent review and also meta-analysis of the ATL studies. And a similar argument about cooperation and competition is also made in the context of thinking about the left hemisphere mapping to dorsal regions with the resultant shunting out of spatial information to the right hemisphere. And in fact, in both hemispheres, there is evidence for both language and spatial representation, with greater tuning of the left hemisphere for language and greater tuning of the right hemisphere for spatial representations. In fact, one does not see any of these hemispheric asymmetries in nonverbal species, even say in macaque. And you might want to see some of Otto Karnoth's work for a discussion about the shunting out of spatial information to the right hemisphere as a function of language acquisition over the phylogenetically. Okay, the very last part that I will tell you about is some more recent work that we've been doing. We're going to present the findings at the Vision Sciences meeting next week, examining more extreme versions of cortical dynamics of face and word recognition in children who have either been hemispherectomized or lobectomized because of pharmacologically intractable epilepsy. So here, for example, I hope you can see, this should be completely black to you. This is a 7-year-old kid who had a right temporal and occipital lobectomy. He has normal IQ and comprehension, no motor deficit. He shouldn't. All the other regions are intact. He has a homonymous hemianopia. Here are the findings. You probably can't see that these are all red over here, means his failure to detect them, and these are all green. And we have scanned this boy at 6-month intervals over a 24-month period. I'm going to show you data, and the whole goal of this developmental mapping is to examine what happens as word and face representations are required, and what happens to those competitive and cooperative dynamics in a perturbed cortical system. So I'll just show you a little bit of data. This is the patient when he was scanned at 7, I think this is 7.5, 2 different sessions. This is the lesion, which I hope you can see really strongly. These are control data from a 7 or 7.5-year-old. He shows, this is a face minus house contrast. You can see that he shows some face selectivity replicable over 6 months in the anterior temporal lobe. There is no apparent OFA or FFA activation. There is extensive selectivity in the anterior temporal lobe. These posterior regions appear to be more involved in the acquisition of word representations. And you can see it over here, that more posterior regions, he's sort of learning to read. There's a glimmer of the VWFA. And the hypothesis is that this acquisition is essentially shunting face recognition to the more anterior regions, given that he does not have a homologous region in the other hemisphere. So we're still in the processes of evaluating change over time. We also have got very extensive mapping of early visual cortex in this individual, both using meridians and PRFs, and if anybody's at VSS next week, you'd be welcome to come and look at those data. And we have scanned about 9 individuals like this. Okay, I'd like to recognize the enormous contribution of collaborators who did the work on development, some of the neuropsychological work, the MVPA studies, and David Platt, with whom I've done much of the computational work. And I will end off by arguing that instead of thinking about segregated representations in 2 different hemispheres, unrelated and independent, we really should start thinking not only about very subtle cooperative and competitive dynamics that occur at the cortical level, and moreover, thinking about what gives rise to this adult mature topographic pattern, and beginning to understand the emergent properties that eventually result in what we see as adult topography. And I'll stop there at 45 minutes.
Sharon. Nope.
Oh, Sharon.
Sharon.
Mel owes me.
You're next, Will.
Is that because you owed me a question from last time?
Yeah.
That was fantastic and well worth the wait and the volcano clouds and the pertussis and so on.
Yeah.
I have a question and a confusion. Maybe I'll start with the question. It seems like one of the implications, both of your argument about what drives the lateralization and also maybe an assumption about what the consequences of lateralization are for acquired brain damage, that you wouldn't expect to see reports of acquired prosopagnosia in pre-literate eras in history, in the kind of medical annals. Do you know if that's true?
You would not see acquired prosopagnosia in other species, lower order species who have no acquisition of word recognition.
In society, in humans, not other species.
In humans that are illiterate.
Yes, that there are medical records that go back to periods of time where literacy was not the norm. And I'm just wondering whether there are any reports of acquired prosopagnosia.
Okay, so firstly, I have never heard of such a thing. It's like one of those sort of divine coincidences that one looks for in the literature. Illiterate people in societies who then go on to have prosopagnosia. I've never heard of such a thing. Actually, I think the prediction that you would make is that such a thing might exist, but there could be prosopagnosia following either left or right hemisphere lesions. It's not that you would not see prosopagnosia. You would not see this undue weighting of prosopagnosia as a function of a right hemisphere lesion.
But if you had bilateral face system, when a unilateral lesion, you'd have backup, right? So you wouldn't, I mean, again, maybe that's an incorrect assumption, but I thought the argument is that in these strongly lateralized systems, you're more vulnerable to a unilateral infarct. No?
So it would be a little bit like taking this purple person here.
Right, yes.
And so a lesion to this region would in fact knock out, I think you're right. I think if you lesion this region, you would still have this purple spot to rely on.
Yeah.
Maybe?
Okay.
So I don't know. If anybody knows of prosopagnosics in some illiterate society, I would love to see such a person.
Okay. My confusion is I'm having trouble understanding why it is not internally inconsistent to your story that you talk about this extension of the foveal region as the argument for the placement of these areas, yet many of your measures involve lateralized word and face, so are tapping peripheral system responses. And I'm just wondering if there's an inconsistency in the logic there, and if the way we recognize faces and words presented in the periphery is actually fundamentally different than how we normally recognize them.
Okay, so we have to put faces and words into the separate visual fields in order to be able to get some hemispheric signature of it. So I have two responses to that. The first is that, of course, there is also representation even of peripheral regions that is somewhat imbalanced in the two hemispheres. And so I will argue that the extent to which we see lateralization following peripheral presentation is still a signature of hemifield stimulation that comes from central vision. We can't show central stimuli here if we want to look at the hemispheric differences. What I would argue, and in fact, maybe I can show it to you afterwards, I might have should have included this slide, is you will notice that in the paradigm that we use, there is actually a stimulus presented first. And we've gone back now and analyzed the hemispheric differences as a function of the centrally presented stimulus, and that is even stronger than the peripheral stimuli. Oh, actually, sorry, let me just say it the other way around. The data that I'm showing you are actually from the central stimulation. Okay. The paradigm is one in which there is a central stimulus, and then there is a half-field stimulus. Responses are made to the half-field stimuli, so we're not analyzing that part of the experiment. When I'm showing you the ERP waveform, it's locked to the presentation of this. So the N170 that I'm telling you about is from the central presentation.
Okay, but
is that clear?
Yeah, but all of the behavioral data come from the lateralized presentation. And I guess so. What I don't know, but you probably do, is whether or not there's evidence that processing a face or a word in the periphery is qualitatively the same as processing it centrally. Whether all of the phenomena that are associated with what I'll call normal face and word recognition, whether those same phenomena exist in peripheral processing.
Okay, so there are actually people in this audience who have run these very experiments and who will tell you that stimulation in the periphery is qualitatively similar to stimulation from central vision, just much weaker.
Okay.
As long as it, I was just going to add that if it's within about
5 degrees, yeah.
then it's going to be basically focal.
Correct.
So,
If we could give the microphone to Laurel, please, and then to Alfonso, and then
Thanks,
to
Sharon.
the gentleman back there.
I agree. That was a great talk. Thank you. My question has to do really with, I want you to speculate a little bit more or say a little bit more about how far you can take this developmental pressure argument. That is, the way you've presented it, it sounds as though the right hemisphere is sort of a passive tabula rasa, waiting to see what will happen, what kind of exposure, what kind of experiences will be presented to the person, that it emerges as a result of those pressures. Do you think that the right hemisphere has any complementary specialization? And in particular, I wonder, and this may not be relevant, but it may be, you didn't at all invoke the notion, which had been very popular in studies of face processing, of this holistic gestalt processing and the relevance of that for faces. And I wonder if that plays into or might play into this account at all. Is it merely the foveal specialization for detailed processing that drives these regions, or is it also something special about the configurational processing?
Okay. Thanks, really excellent set of questions. So the first thing that I would argue is that the right hemisphere is not simply the sort of lazy, just like hanging about waiting to take on some functions. We know, of course, and I will argue that the same competitive dynamics with respect to language and spatial representation play out very early. And so, in fact, you see this kind of asymmetry for spatial representations very early in the right hemisphere. So it's not doing nothing. Right. And you actually do want to have a right hemisphere rather than not have one. The only claim that I'm making is in that this particular domain, there is initially bilateral representation of faces, and then subsequent to this tuning, you begin to see this weighted asymmetry. Your second question has to do with, are there other properties, hemispheric properties, sort of fundamental computations that differentiate between the two hemispheres? Because, of course, you could ask, why is it that language gets set up in the left hemisphere for the majority of individuals? Maybe there really is something extremely privileged and special about the left hemisphere. This, of course, is subject to enormous debate with a whole slew of hypotheses about what the fundamental differences might be, including things like different processing of temporal rate in the left and the right hemisphere, different receptor field sizes at lower levels, configural versus part-based processing, spatial frequency differences. I don't think any of those are necessarily mutually exclusive with anything that I've told you. One recent study that we did, which looks at spatial frequency function and tuning of the hemispheres in young children, seems to show that initially young children show no spatial frequency differences. The standard story is that the right hemisphere is more low spatial frequency, left hemisphere more high spatial frequency. There are, in fact, no spatial frequency differences in young children until they learn to read. And then you begin to see the tuning of the left hemisphere. Okay. And this may be true for these other properties as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can we have Alfonso and then Mika and then Alex and then Jerry, and then we'll see where we are.
There is a particular way of style of theorizing that assumes that in understanding how the brain works, we have to postulate different levels of representation. And that the enterprise that we engage in is to try and make claims about what those representations are at some level of analysis. And in the case, in your presentation, you've identified these posterior areas where you say where words and letters and faces all seem to be involved in similar things. So what is your claim? Is your claim that the same neurons are engaged in processing faces and letters? And if so, what is the level of representation that is shared by words and faces? In the absence of such a claim, it's not clear to me what point you're making. It could be that, in fact, nearby neurons are specialized for faces and words, or the characteristics of those elements, and they just happen to live in the same area, nearby each other. Okay? Now, this is a very different theory from a theory that says that the same neurons are involved in processing both. And it wasn't clear to me what your claim was.
Okay.
So the reason for bringing this up, in part, is that there are some data out there. Some of the people who generated them were in this room, actually, from Amir's lab and other people who have shown that in the congenitally blind, you get development of areas, even though there is no visual experience, and therefore you can appeal to a sort of visual argument about fixating. Okay. So I guess the question I'm asking is, what is the scope of the theory with respect to what claims you're making, and what kind of evidence speaks to this level of claims you're making?
Okay. It's actually many questions. I'll try and deal with them part by part. Let me first start with the end part of your question, and that is that there are studies, say in congenitally blind, that show that these regions of cortex come to be activated for Braille letters. In fact, there's a poster downstairs, I think Scott Farrell's poster, is it? I just saw so many posters, showing that in congenitally blind individuals, you can see activation in this region for voices or faces. Okay, for speech. Okay. And so the question is like, what does that mean now? Does this like blow this theory out of the water? Micah Murray, somewhere, yeah, also told us at the poster session how these kinds of regions are rather heteromodal and come to be tuned. And so you could ask, so then what is the property of this particular region? And I'm going to argue that this region is an excellent pattern recognizer. Something about like the second order statistics or higher order statistics of the input. It turns out it's an extremely well situated region to combine input from different sensory modalities. It's like a nice, the geocenter for heteromodal coupling. And so it's not surprising to me that in congenitally blind and individuals show both Braille and voice activation in such regions of cortex. Okay, so let's set that aside and talk to the sort of the biblical question about the nature of the representation and the scope of the representation. It's incontrovertible that there are different levels of representation in cortex. Nobody is going to argue that you're going to see complex patterns represented in area V1. In V1, you're going to get representations that are more associated with the capabilities of V1 neurons. So I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about representations that are of the second order statistics and complexity. And that's really the scope of my argument about representation. And then you asked, well, what exactly is being represented, sort of given that we're talking about the second order statistics? What is the nature of the representation in these regions of cortex? Is it that just nearby neurons code for different properties, but they are contiguous anatomically? The first part of the argument is that yes, they are contiguous anatomically. Because the standard wisdom is that face representation is in the right hemisphere and word representation is in the left hemisphere. So the first point is that that does not hold because we see bilateral activation to such an extent that you can see interdigitation of voxels, forget about neurons, of voxels that show selective above chance discrimination for face and word identity. Okay. So then you could say, well, we have these voxels that are red, in fact, that show above chance discrimination for both faces and words. And I think that is an intriguing issue. Of course, voxels have got, 10,000 neurons in it, and so we may just be seeing what looks like an overlap, but in fact there are entirely segregated subsets of neurons within that voxel. We can't answer that question. It would be really good, somebody, to do some kind of, adaptation study, although that still may not even have sufficient sensitivity, to be able to decompose the relative representational selectivity in, say, overlapping voxels. Does that make sense?
Yes, but what's your theory? That is, I mean, everything you've said is to repeat the question of there can be different neurons, but those are very different theories. So that your claim then, if in fact it turns out that different neurons code for different kinds of characteristics and therefore different kinds of representations, then it's just a mere accident of where it is in the brain that they live. Okay? Now you need to have a theory then of why they go there, and we can discuss that. But computationally, you're distinguishing those two. So if you were to construct a model a la Dave and so on, you would have different layers responding, or different. There would be specialization for the kinds of units that would respond to faces and letters. And so it's not clear to me still what the theoretical claim in the end is.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether you're asking me about whether there are different neurons or what the output of the system, why there is a unitary output of the system, why it settles on the representation of a face versus a word versus a house, for example. Let me try and deal with the neuron piece of it first. And I'll take an extreme stand and argue that it might even be the case that at a single unit level, we would see activation for both faces and words. Pure speculation. Because in fact, there are visual properties. There could be neurons that are tuned to visual properties of the input, for example, even the central location of the stimuli that give rise to this interdigitation. So I don't know the answer. I don't know. So I will theoretically say that all bets are off. There may in fact be individual neurons that show selectivity for more than a single class of stimuli. We may not know it in this particular region, but we certainly know from many monkey physiology studies that the tuning of an individual neuron is not all or none. You can see multiplexing of individual neurons. Why wouldn't you see that in human cortex? So that's my answer. So my theoretical assumption is, for sure, neurons will operate expediently and extract from the statistics of the input as much as they possibly can for optimal function. They can be tuned, they can be malleable. There is no reason that they shouldn't multiplex.
Thanks for the nod for the multisensory bit. I had a question about pushing and pulling between the hemispheres, and if you have insights on that. So have you examined the data, either ERP or fMRI, normalizing in one manner or another to see if it's that the left hemisphere gets less selective and the right hemisphere gets more selective, or vice versa, or both?
You mean over the course of development?
Yeah.
So, for example, we should subtract out, say, the N170 on the words from the N170 on faces to look at the selective differences. Yes, absolutely. In fact, the correlation plot that I showed earlier on is a normalization plot. So it would be something like faces in the right N170 minus faces in the left 170, potentially even over the combination of those, some kind of normalization index. It's a selectivity result, not an absolute magnitude difference.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And do you have any data on, sorry, I figure everyone else is asking 5 questions.
Yeah. Yeah, keep going.
Do you have any data on looking strategies that might contribute to hemispheric
Yeah. The answer is no, because in fact we nail everybody with an eye tracker to fixation. But indeed, there may be free viewing manifestations of the hemispheres. The problem there is that we don't know whether that's cause or effect. And so mostly what I've tried to do is just control the whole thing rather than letting sort of chaos reign in the system.
We're going to extend the discussion session just so we keep Marlene up there for a while. So I'm going to take away from this the idea that in the left hemisphere we should stop talking about visual word form area and fusiform face area, and instead concentrate on what we think the computations might be in a relatively uniform part of the fusiform. So I'm going to tell you about I hate to bring this to a discussion of differences in data, so let me just tell you what we find and tell me if it's a problem. And the findings are that if you look in the left hemisphere and you localize word processing and face processing in individuals, number one, you do find differences, but the differences are lawful. That in
Lawful.
lawful in the terms of the spatial relationships, that is, that the word form stuff is lateral to the face. It's primarily in the sulcus and not in the lateral part of the fusiform. And secondly, at the individual level, those differences in peaks are predictive of differences in connectivity. Is that a problem for the way you're thinking or not?
It's awesome. It's exactly what one might expect from a system that both interdigitates but also is not random. And in fact...
But it's not interdigitated. Look, you can talk about foveal participation in this as one of the driving forces, right? But there are other reasons that the cortex got organized the way it is. It does not appear to be random, and there's nothing in what you've said so far that would predict any differences in the spatial organization.
So, in fact, I would argue that there is one very important principle that I've spoken about that will drive these different connectivity profiles, and that is the coupling of the visual word form area to language areas. And in fact, when you begin to look at these studies, and if for those who are not familiar with it, I recommend that you read Karin Amunds's anatomical studies, and there's also a Kevin Wiener, Grol-Spector paper that's coming out that specifically show the sort of somewhat more laterally biased versus medially biased face versus visual word form area entirely predicted by the structural connectivity to language areas. So you're absolutely right. There are regularities that govern connectivity in the brain, and those regularities come in to organize biases, even in regions such as this. I'm completely with you.
So you started off by saying that things that go together should be together and things that shouldn't go together should be separate. But you then had a slide, I think, I may have misremembered this, where you showed that in adolescence you see lateralization in language but not in face, which suggests that there's a kind of dynamic to the tethering that isn't completely complementary. It's not the case that you will, if you have a balloon in your hand and you squeeze it, a little bit pops out on one side, and you squeeze that side and it pops out of the other. There's a delay between specialization or sensitivity developing in one and then this shunting out. Are you able to speculate as to why that is? What is the, if you like, the representational change or change of sensitivity that's giving rise to this delay across time rather than it being simultaneous?
I do think that there is a delay, a sort of temporal delay over development. That's what we see here. We see that adolescents show an earlier advantage or earlier lateralization of words without the lateralization of faces, and then that begins to kick in here. And we see this in the ERP studies as well. And so the question is, what is exactly going on during this protracted period? I don't know, obviously, but I will argue that there has to be both tuning in the left hemisphere for things that should go together to be increasingly coupled. So we even know, for example, that plasticity, say as manifest in training studies over white matter, take time to emerge. And so I'm going to hypothetically speculate that this coupling in the left hemisphere takes time to emerge, and that then will have a consequent effect on the lateralization in the right hemisphere. There is no way you wake up one morning and suddenly the system is in an entirely different state. In fact, what would be particularly useful for some person who really wants to do this is to examine microgenetically over sort of very close intervals the malleability or the switch that A gives rise to this over a single individual, and then how this difference begins to emerge within that same individual.
So the very slight worry I have about that is that if I understood you rightly, you're putting a little bit of the responsibility onto maturational processes, because young adolescents actually are pretty good at faces and they're pretty good at words. So there isn't the kind of selective functional pressure to segregate, as one might expect from the things that go together should go together and things that need to be separate have to be separate. There is a stage where one can actually do pretty well without having the segregation. And so in a sense you're having to pull out from the hat this little maturational thing.
I'm not sure that it's maturation necessarily, because of course one can see in training studies in adults who you would think are at asymptote, you can see changes, you can see sort of tuning and altered dynamics in the system. There is no reason to think that those are not at play in these adolescents who may already be at asymptote in their maturational function.
Thanks, Marlene. It was lovely. So the first question I have is about the actual behavioral performance, not in these studies, but you did show some correlational aspect with respect to language and laterality. But what about, for example, face recognition, not in the test that you have done, but actually, let's say, super recognizers versus, or some axis of face recognition, whether that correlates or is predicted by the laterality of the face network. And another thing that I wanted to ask...
No, hang on, let me finish, let me answer that question before we go further. The data that I have not shown you are data from a study that is the complement of the developmental dyslexia, and that is the same experiment. At some point it's like I can't show you the same experiment over and over again, but with individuals who are congenitally prosopagnosia. Okay, so these are individuals who are impaired in face recognition, apparently of lifelong duration. So we know about the face recognition performance, and we've done the same experiment, and we have the ERP data as well that show that you can correlate the severity of the face recognition performance with the failure to lateralize. Does that help?
They have a bilateral like equilibrium between the two
I don't know if I included, yes, that's correct. I don't know if I included that slide here at the end. But yes, that's essentially the result. So it's true that you can predict the decrement in face recognition as a function of the alaterality.
So in that sense, it's symmetric between
the two. These are complements of each other.
And the second question I have is with respect to the actual network that supports these, because it could be that these two different, left and right, have some different computational strategies to handle stimuli. And once the person is not exposed to words or is exposed to faces through development, both of these networks, although they have different computational strategies or are assisting in face recognition, but once, for example, language is acquired, or specifically reading, then you would have the left, because of some computational advantage, drive the... so do you think it has to do with some, and that might even explain why congenitally blind are using the left, and for example you see the LOTV or the right hemisphere for more spatial structure that is 3D rather than 2D. So do you think it also has to do with these two networks supporting different spatial or even 3 versus 2D spatial structure of representation?
Yes, so I realize I might have not indicated to you that although my focus was specifically on ventral cortex and potentially the coupling of ventral cortex with language regions, these, of course, there are no firewalls between these regions and other parts of cortex. So there is no reason to think that, for example, tuning for spatial representations in the right hemisphere are irrelevant to the kinds of computations that go on in the right hemisphere. So I don't think that the left and the right hemisphere are absolutely equal just over different image statistics. I think there are indeed other kinds of functions in the hemispheres in either proximal or even remote regions that may well play into slightly different manifestations.
I think reluctantly, I'm going to allow us to have lunch.
Thank you.
Marlene, thank you so much.